Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
I instigated getting the two cartridge cases from these murders compared. They were said to be from a Winchester-made 9mm Parabellum. The nature of the marks on each cartridge case, these things were all fired from the same firearm, so we had the same firearm involved with both murders.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In this episode, a story of gang-related murders in London's black community in the late 90s and the massive manhunt after the July the 21st attempted bombings in London in 2005. Two hugely challenging investigations in which forensic science played a vital role. Both forced the police to innovate in how they gather intelligence and use forensics while under intense public scrutiny. Well, helping us to re-examine these pivotal cases is former Special Advisor with the Forensic Science Service of the Metropolitan Police, Ray Fysh, a pioneer of forensic techniques which have since become standard in solving crimes. Ray, welcome to True Criminals.
Thank you very much.
The nation is fascinated, me included, by programmes like CSI, Silent Witness, etc. How did you get into forensics in the first place?
Very boring, actually. I was the first person in family to pass me 11 plus, and eventually I went to a grammar stream school, got my O-levels, then wanted to stay on to A-levels. My father was against it, but eventually got persuaded that I could get A-levels. So after my A-levels, there was no chance of me going to university. My parents wouldn't allow it. So I needed a job. And a job advert came out from Assistant Scientific Officer, Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Laboratory. I said, well, that sounds all right. So I applied, and I was fortunate enough. I was first of a large influx of junior forensic scientists employed in 1971. I got there. I thought I was bee's knees then, and realised I was basically no more than a bottle washer. So I had to get some qualifications. So I studied part-time, got my degree, became a toxicologist, case reporting officer, started giving evidence in court, and just ended up as head of the toxicology department for the Metropolitan Police when we got merged with the Forensic Science Service, which is when I got the role of specialist advisor, which basically advises police on the use of forensic science in the investigation and to coordinate the results and be the front, if you like, of the forensic science to the investigation team. Now, it's not only the scientists from the Forensic Science Service I headed up, it was other scientists outside universities, etc., used to come under my umbrella, if you like.
A gripping world that you really fell into, perhaps just serendipitously. Has it been an incredible and fascinating career, and are you thrilled that you ended up almost by accident in this world?
Yeah, I say I had the best job in the world. A lot of people say that, but I believe I did. It's never a problem to go to work. I ended up as a specialist advisor, working most weeks, 7 days a week. I got involved with great investigations, wonderful police officers, learned a lot about major crime investigation from them, and enjoyed every minute of it.
Is your world of real CSI anything like the multitude of TV and film depictions of CSI?
My wife doesn't allow me to watch any of those programs on television because the first thing I do is I criticise and I say it's nothing like that. They don't do that. People like Silent Witness. She seems to do the investigation, the pathology, the forensic science, and also prosecutes the case, doesn't she? She does the lot.
Amelia Fox, you're talking about.
And people often ask me, what about these television programs? It really annoys me when you've got these CSIs in there all suited and booted and everything. Then the SIO just walks through the crime scene in his suit and probably with a cigarette on as well.
I can see why it must be frustrating. Let's start this episode with the investigation into gangland murders in London in June and July 1998, codename Operation Sturdy. Martin, will you set the scene for us and share your recollections of reporting this story at the time?
This was a series of crimes, dreadful by anybody's standards, and they were carried out by a pair of Jamaican gang members who had entered the UK illegally. Tyrone Bigger Hart, who was also known by an alias Anthony Rowbottom, and Kurt Peppy Roberts. These two were part of a so-called Yardie gang, essentially organised criminals from Jamaica, and they went on a 5-week murder and rape spree in London. And I remember Yardie gangs was something that we heard an awful lot of in the 90s. On the 25th of June 1998, Hart and Roberts forced their way into a flat in Brixton in South London, where Kirk and Avril Johnson lived with their children. They tied up the family, demanded money, and then brutally attacked them. Avril Johnson, who was a local DJ and the sister of a reggae artist called Tipper Irie, was shot in the head in front of her 2 little girls. They were 7 years and 18 months old. Her husband Kirk had his throat cut, but miraculously survived by pretending to be dead. It was a terrible crime. The community, understandably, was horrified. Nobody knew who was behind it. The attackers were simply faceless, armed men.
And Martin, it wasn't long before they struck again.
4 days later, on the 29th of June, there was a second murder. The victim was Michelle Carby, a mother of 3. She was found tied up and shot through the head in her home. Her young children found her body the next morning. It's difficult to imagine the trauma that they suffered. At this point, police suspected a gang doing what they called home invasion-style murders, but they simply didn't know who they were. Then, nearly 3 weeks later, there was another killing. The victim this time was Patrick Ferguson. He was a 34-year-old plasterer. He was shot dead in a suspected robbery. So, in the span of a few weeks, there were at least 3 murders and many other violent crimes, including rape and attempted murder.
Ray, this was a time before 21st century forensics, extensive DNA databases, CCTV on every street corner. You were a senior forensic advisor at the Met. What forensic tools did your team use to connect these crime scenes and zero in on Hart and Roberts?
I got involved in this Operation Sturdy just after the murder of Michelle Carberry. I got a call from the yard from the Detective Chief Superintendent, Jeff Rees, who was informed me about these crimes, wanted me involved, and I went over there and met him. Shortly afterwards, Jeff Rees bowed out, and they had SIOs for those 2 murders. DCI Steve Kupis, who became very much centred in this investigation, was the investigation on the Tulsa or the Brixton job, and Andrew Kay for the Michelle Carberry. I met with those, we discussed it. I instigated getting the 2 cartridge cases from these murders compared, and they matched each other. They were said to be from a Winchester 9mm Parabellum caliber cartridge cases. He said the nature of the marks on each cartridge case, these things were all fired from the same firearm. So we had the link there. We had the same firearm involved with both murders. And the nature of the marks, they were from a weapon. It's a pistol that had been deactivated, then reactivated. And that was going on a lot at that sort of time, this reactivation of deactivated firearms. So we had the link there.
So a link from ballistics there.
Yeah, this was from the firearms point of view. The ballistics, Avril Johnson had blackening found on the inside of the skull. So she was shot at point blank range. The pistol was held to her head when it was pulled. And Patrick Ferguson was shot within 2 feet. But shortly after the murders of Michelle Carberry, there was the murder of Patrick Ferguson. And Sue Akers became the SIO on that inquiry. And overseeing those 3 SIOs was Detective Chief Superintendent Dave Cox from Hendon. So we had this joint investigation. The biggest thing the police had problems with was getting names, getting the black community to talk about these crimes. And I do remember Steve Cooperage going about a lot of work with the community leaders, trying to get them on board to try and get names, because without that, they felt that we were unlikely to get anywhere with this case.
And Ray, another lead came through what was then fairly new technology, but now utterly commonplace, mobile phones.
Yeah, mobile phones. There was a rape that had occurred before the murder of Avril Johnson. And in that rape, it's very similar in MO, people bursting through the door, 2, 3 of them. One person raped the female in the flat. Her boyfriend got stabbed by the others. They were tied up. And a mobile phone was stolen. In the Avril Johnson case, besides about £300 in cash, some really quite cheap jewellery was stolen, but also, again, a mobile phone. So we had 2 mobile phones was stolen. Police set about looking at the call history on these mobile phones, and it was found that both phones were used to phone back to Jamaica. So they started to trace the numbers which they'd phoned back to, and it turned out to be the sister of one, her own Hart, that was being phoned. So that gave the police their first lead. They knew from Jamaican police that her own Hart was a gangland member. He had escaped custody in Jamaica and thought to be in the UK. So he became number one find person, so to speak.
The telephone record analysis, Ray, in those days was relatively new, wasn't it? But it provided a clear trail. And I remember that detail coming out during the trial. Now, looking back, it was a very 1990s phenomenon. These were criminals who didn't yet understand that murder victims' phones, anybody's phones, could be traced. And that meant that the net tightened on Hart and Roberts.
Yes, it did. There was a little bits of other things that were involved when they were really looking for these individuals. I remember one day I was driving across Blackheath on the way into London and got a phone call from Steve Coopish. They'd been led to a flat where they thought that these 2 individuals may have held out. They put the flat under surveillance. They weren't there. But Steve Coopish came up with an unusual suggestion. He wanted scientists to go in and look at the footwear marks on the floor of that flat to see if they were the same footwear marks as the ones in the house of Avril Johnson, to prove that the individuals that had committed the Avril Johnson case had actually been in that flat as well. We put that in and we got footwear marks from both flats. So they had been there. A search of the dustbin also recovered jewellery that had been stolen from around the crimes. So from that, they would then intensify around getting to know where our own Hart was and Kurt Roberts.
So who was arrested where, Martin?
Hart was arrested in Birmingham, where undercover officers had tracked him to an address. Roberts was caught in London. There was also a third man called Kishon Blackburn. He was part of the gang and later convicted of a rape during the crime spree. In court, I remember, Ray, that the evidence against them was overwhelming.
Yes, the rape in Stockwell, the semen was found on the vaginal swab, and DNA profiling matched that of Kurt Roberts. So that part put to bed. When Hart was arrested, a Nike training shoe was recovered. That was searched for blood. Blood was found on that training shoe. In fact, when that was profiled, that matched the third victim, Patrick Ferguson. So the evidence was linking up together with the cartridge cases, and finally fingerprints. The Tulse Hill scene, which was Brixton scene, Avril Johnson, a number of marks were identified from Kurt Roberts, from the magazine rack, a gold instant milk tin, a drawer in the bedroom, a bedside cabinet, and boxes. There were a number of shoe boxes. I remember going to this scene, and there were hundreds of empty shoe boxes in the wardrobes. And in fact, they hadn't been fingerprinted at the time, but I suggested they'd get them fingerprinted, and sure enough, Kurt Roberts' fingerprints turned up on that. There seemed to be a reluctance to extensively fingerprint these places. And I know on Patrick Ferguson, they did very little fingerprinted. I was asked to go down there by Sue Akers. This is in the book. So Sue Akers asked, is there anything else we could do? I said, yeah, we can get this lot fingerprinted. And we're relying on very early information. You go very far into the flat.
Basic errors. The trial came to an end in late 1999, and Hart, who was 28, was convicted of murdering Avril Johnson and Patrick Ferguson, among other charges, and he got life in prison. His accomplice Roberts, who was 19 at the time, was convicted of Avril's murder and of the rape. The jury were hung over the charge of murdering Michelle Carby. They couldn't pin that on the pair, so that particular charge was left on the file, although there seemed little doubt to many of those involved that it was them. Hart and Roberts were not only jailed, but slated for deportation whenever they finished their sentences, though I suppose it's very unlikely that they'll ever be released. It was a big case for the Met, and the judge at the Old Bailey called Hart and Roberts an affront to civilised society. He also called them part of an execution squad. And the case had a significant legacy because it led to the wider-ranging Operation Trident that was put together to crack down on gun violence within some of London's black community, violence often that was tied to the drug trade.
Operation Trident was an idea from Steve Kupis. He was central to a lot of this. He wanted a dedicated team to investigate all so-called black on black. I struggle to find another word for that, so I apologise if it offends anybody. But this gangland style criminality. And setting up Trident meant that information and intelligence gathering would be a lot stronger. You haven't got each individual teams all over London investigating their own individual little case. You've got them all coming in a central team. So intelligence, gang members, associated to various gangs, all this intelligence will be internal and built up. It's very much based on intelligence gathering. And Trident, I thought, was a huge success for a while.
Am I right in thinking that those 1998 murders, Operation Sturdy, proved then perhaps a turning point for London policing?
I think it did with the setup of Operation Trident. They really start to get on top of this gangland-style killings.
Getting a predominantly white police force to gather intelligence from within the black community can't have been easy. Was it the shock of the violence, the sheer level of violence, that prompted people eventually to come forward and start naming names?
It was really getting the leaders in the community, people that used to speak out for them. And it was getting these people really on board and saying, look, you've got to help us. Without your help, we're not going to solve these crimes. So it got them on board. They became the mouthpiece of the police force for the investigation team. And then people started to come forward to them. They used to bring to the police and say, look, I've got something to tell you. So it was really gathering that information.
Which was an addition to the forensic work.
Yeah, in addition to the forensic work, which was significant in the murders of Avril Johnson and Patrick Ferguson. But without those names, we wouldn't have got the results linking to those people without samples from those people. So the information coming forward.
So, Ray, let's fast forward 7 years to 2005 and a very different criminal case, but again, one in which forensic science was key. On July the 7th, 2005, London was hit by 4 blasts on the transport network, the 7/7 bombings as they became known. Now, we've previously explored the story in detail in episodes 34 and 35 of True Criminals. We've all got very vivid memories of that day, Ray, but what were yours?
I was actually at Dartford Police Station on what I really struggled to remember. But I was down there when news came through that there was bombings in London. We gathered around the television set and started to watch the news, as everybody did. Then I got a pager message, because we used to have the message pages in those days. Basically, get back to London, to the lab, as quickly as possible. So I went back to the lab. At that time, forensic science was still behind the investigation. And I've been beating on about this relentlessly for a while, saying we've got to get better at being closer to the investigations and being more upfront. And this gave us the chance of doing that. I had a new boss at the time, and I put to him my thought. I thought if we could get the laboratory working 24 hours a day, getting dedicated scientists working 12-hour shifts, 2 12-hour shifts, as long as they do that, work a minimum of 10 hours, but work 12 if they can, more if they feel the need to. and work 24 hours a day. We could get the DNA laboratory running 24 hours a day. We could start really making a headroad into these cases. I was pushed forward really by seeing how murder investigation teams work. They basically break the back of the inquiry very early on, really work as many hours as you need to break the back of the inquiry. And I wanted that sort of attitude in forensic science. And fortunately, they went with it. I knew we would get certain scientists on board and they would do it. I knew certain scientists wouldn't do it. I respected that. They had family lives and everything. I respected that. But there was a number of young scientists and some fairly senior scientists who were willing to get on board with it. They took care of all the pastoral things, like the Army and Navy Club, that they worked late into the night, difficult getting home. They had a bed there if they needed it, and they had food outlets and everything. So all that was taken care of. And I was able then to put forward to SO13, as it was then, that if they get exhibits into the laboratory by 8 a.m. one morning, we will get all results out, including DNA profiling, by 8 a.m. the following morning. And that was on the proviso that they didn't bury us, first of all, with a whole load of exhibit. If they were sensible, prioritise their submissions, we would turn them around in 24 hours. And we will continue that 7 days a week until the case is broken. They went with it and we started on that, and we managed to fulfill that promise in getting the basic forensic stuff done to confirm these 4 bombers and 7/7.
It was the first suicide terror attack on British soil. 4 Islamist extremists, all British-born, carried explosives in backpacks and blew themselves up among commuters during the morning rush hour. Both Martin and I were on shift that day, Martin at Sky, me at 5 News, and covered the story and then for the weeks of the aftermath. And even amid that carnage, forensic teams were on the ground collecting tiny bomb fragments, body parts and other evidence to piece together the story. Ray, you advised on this. Can you describe what the forensic work entailed at those crime scenes?
In the Metropolitan Police, for normal, if there are such things, run-of-the-mill murder cases, they have civilian senior crime officers. They are people that are trained to go and recover forensic evidence, package it and get it submitted to the laboratory. The SO13 were different. They had dedicated police officers who carried out this role.
SO13, the anti-terrorist branch, Ray.
Yeah, it was SO13 then, now SO15. It changed shortly after from anti-terrorist team to counter-terrorism command. But SO13 had their own dedicated police officers who were specifically trained to deal with bomb scenes. Now, often these were ex-military, and ex-military being of that nature, they will work through horrendous conditions, work long hours, basically sleep wherever they can and continue working. So they are really dedicated. They're seen as the cream of the scenes of crime, but they work through some horrendous recovery of these bodies and the damage that it caused on the chains and the bus outside Tavistock Square. But they recovered a vast amount of forensic evidence. There was 2 strings to the 7/7 inquiry. One was victim identification, and that was in fact carried out by LGC. That wasn't dealt with by us. They tied that off and said, leave that. You just deal with the criminal side of the inquiry. In most murders, right, you're normally looking for just one offender. Identify the offender, move on. Counter-terrorism is totally different. You're not only looking for the offenders, but you're looking for the people that were involved, people that knew about it, people that funded it, the people that were brains behind it. So you're not only looking for the identity of one person, you're looking for a whole team of people. And that's what was stressed upon us. We dealt with the bomb factory in Beeston in Leeds. But one of the things that I became aware of fairly early on in these inquiries is that we'd had years of experience of dealing with IRA terrorists, the IRA campaign. Now, the IRA terrorists did everything in their power not to leave their identity at the scene. They cleaned scenes, they were meticulous in everything they did. And my colleague, Anne Preston, dealt with a lot of the Irish campaign. Whereas now, the suicide bombers, what we learned is They're expecting to die anyway, so they weren't worried about their identity. And in fact, they actively promoted being known for martyrdom. And they often carried with them personal effects, things like toothbrushes, deodorants, gym cards, etc., etc. So their identity was known fairly early on. We confirmed it through the remains of body and DNA analysis. Some of them were on the DNA database. Other was confirmed through taking paternity samples from mum and dad and confirmed their DNA that way. So 7/7 was running nicely, so to speak. The bomb factory, we had large numbers of items from there, which we were working through, reasonable pace, deal with quick wins first, things like drinks containers, cigarette ends and everything. We basically submit it into DNA, get results out. Then the bigger items, more evidential sniffed it, got 2 wires twisted together, DNA from the twist. So we were working through all that. Now, I've got to say, all the scientists that came on board with that, and there were some fairly junior ones as well, really stepped up to the plate.
There were 52 victims, Ray, 52 people who'd headed off to the office or wherever they were going that day who didn't come home. And I'm guessing that thought, when you and your teams were working very long hours in some pretty dreadful circumstances, that thought was never too far away from the front of your mind.
Well, it never is if such a large number of victims who could be people's relatives, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and they were just going around their daily business. But I grew up throughout the 70s working in central London with the IRA campaign. We never thought any more about it. We went about our business, and I'm sure you did as well. It's a bit of a pain of the traffic disruption and everything, but you just carry on with it, don't you? And the same with us. We just carried on with it. And they knew they were doing a good job.
There was one particularly urgent question, wasn't there? What type of explosives had been used? How did you and your forensics team work that out?
It was thought to be a mixture of peroxide and black pepper, was the main charge. There are a 5-litre container of which the main charge is put in. Now, the peroxide has got to be of sufficiently high concentration.
Hydrogen peroxide is an ingredient of cleaning fluid that you can buy not so easily today, but at the time you could buy in great quantities in the high street and nobody batted an eyelid.
It's most common usage for whitening or lightening hair.
Hair bleach, isn't it?
Hairdressers.
Yeah.
I know me and you both use that, Martin, but
it costs a lot of money to get Martin's hair colour, that's for sure.
But the stuff you buy in the high street is not much good as an explosive unless you can increase a very low concentration of hydrogen peroxide. You have to boil it to get rid of the water, the liquid.
You have to increase the concentration. The highest percentage commercial one you can buy is around 18%, and that is sold to hairdressers, etc. The one on the high street is around 9%. You have to get the concentration of the hydrogen peroxide up to 72%. And to do that, you need to boil off the water to concentrate the hydrogen peroxide. But that is quite a difficult task, even in a fully operational laboratory. Hydrogen peroxide is a very aggressive chemical. It decomposes quite easily to form water and oxygen, because that's all it is. It's water with an extra oxygen molecule attached. So they had to concentrate this stuff. But they knew it was hydrogen peroxide. They knew the explosives went off because they killed people. So they thought it was a peroxide black pepper mixture, which was placed in the 5-litre tub. Inside that main charge was a detonator, probably something like TATP. A hole was drilled through the bottom, put the detonator in, and to the detonator is a light bulb where the glass bulb has been removed to expose the filament. Attached to that light bulb is wires, which then goes to battery terminals. By putting the battery on, heats the light bulb up, the detonator goes off, and that sets off the main charge. And that's what thought to have happened in 7/7.
I know that it wasn't your team that was tasked with this, but another grim task was identifying the victims, 52 people. That must have been a huge challenge given the nature of the explosions. Can you give us an idea of what investigators are looking for and what kind of painstaking work is involved in that?
We weren't involved with victim identification, but they would have gone on personal effects, but a lot of these bodies were. really dismembered. They're totally blown apart. But then it's down to paternity testing, DNA. They set up a huge off-site mortuary where these samples were taken. So people were ringing in saying, my son has to come home, my daughter has to come home, wife, husband, whatever. So paternity samples would be taken from all of those. The various body parts would be DNA profiled and then cross-matched with the paternity samples. And that would have been an ongoing process. But people I know from fairly early on were ringing in saying, oh, my son went to London today. I can't get in contact with him. Immediately a team would be sent round to get paternity samples or samples from their personal effects, things like razors, combs, toothbrushes. Toothbrush is an excellent sample for paternity DNA.
One of the bombers' parents actually phoned in, as you've been describing, on the first night, saying that their son, the youngest of the bombers, hadn't come home. They thought he'd gone to London. The police publicly named the 4 suicide bombers very quickly, just 5 days after 7/7, even though they knew their identities before that. But how were they able so quickly to identify the bombers?
Suicide bombers didn't hide their identities and they took personal items with them. So where you look at the bomb scene, it's normally fairly obvious where X marks the spot where the device was detonated. So around there, what personal effects around there, and there were gym cards and various bits. There was a torn photograph of a family which contained one of the suicide bombers, etc., etc. So these were known. It was only then that they went about actually confirming their identity by DNA, and again, using either the DNA that some of them were on the database, others were paternity samples, and things like that.
And then while London was still reeling from 7/7, just 2 weeks later came another nightmare. On July the 21st, there were reports of 4 more bombs on the transport system, this time at Warren Street, Oval and Shepherd's Bush tube stations, and one on a bus in East London. Fortunately, these devices failed to detonate properly, so no one was killed. But Martin, for a few really frightening hours, we all feared another 7/7 was unfolding, didn't we?
We did. It turned out to be 7/7, but without the carnage. When the news broke around midday that there'd been explosions on the underground and a bus, everybody's fear was it's happening again. And initial reports spoke of 4 blasts, but oddly there were no casualties. I think I reported on the day that there was somebody who was slightly injured. And we soon learned why there weren't the casualties. The detonators had gone off, but the main explosive charges hadn't. Witnesses spoke of hearing gunshots initially, but that was explained away eventually by them hearing the detonators go off. 4 would-be suicide bombers had attempted to kill dozens of people, yet by some stroke of luck or bad bomb-making, not a single innocent life was lost. As reporters, we were scrambling to make sense of it all, getting CCTV images of men running away from stations, witnesses describing smoke and a sharp chemical smell.
And almost immediately, Martin, the manhunt for the would-be bombers began.
Yes, the Met launched what's known as Operation Vivace. All these operations get given particular names. Normally they bear no resemblance to what the investigation is about. They're plucked from a list of operational names. The next day, 22nd of July, an innocent Brazilian man, Jean-Charles de Menezes, was tragically mistaken for one of those suspects and was fatally shot by the police. That showed just how on edge everybody was, and the police were under immense pressure to stop those terrorists before they could strike again. That was everybody's fear, that they'd survived, their bombs hadn't gone off. Why wouldn't they try again? But then, by the 29th of July, 8 days after those attempted bombings, all the main suspects were in custody. One of them, Hussein Osman, he'd fled the country on the Eurostar, but was arrested in Rome. 2 others, Mukhtar Saeed Ibrahim and Ramzi Mohammed, were tracked to a flat in North Kensington and dramatically captured by armed police. And the 4th man, Yassin Hassan Omar, was caught in a dawn raid in Birmingham. Officers stunned him with a taser and dragged him out of a hiding place wrapped in a blanket. I reported on those arrests live. It was like watching a thriller unfold in real time.
It's incredible that in barely over a week, police had tracked down every one of the suspects, even with all the chaos and pressure. It was a huge counter-terror success for the Met, apart from that dreadful, tragic mistake at Stockwell.
Yes, the shooting of Jean-Charles de Menezes threw a terrible shadow over what ultimately was a very successful and fast-moving operation by the Met. It was extraordinarily fast. Operation Vivace ultimately led to over 40 arrests connected to that failed plot. And all of that within a few months. They roped in people who'd harboured the bombers or helped them.
It was a really intense week, Ray. What role did forensics play in Operation Vivace?
We were doing the routine forensic stuff, identifying the various devices, linking the 4 suspects, and in fact the 5th suspect. Besides the 4 that had failed to go off, 1 was in fact dumped at Little Wormwood Scrubs. So there were 5 would-be suicide bombers. We had, through DNA, linked all of those to the various scenes. One was from a rucksack clip, got DNA from that, which matched one of the suspects. Another is quite a famous CCTV footage of a person running out of the Oval Station with a New York hoodie on. He dumped this fairly close to that. DNA linked it back to him. And there was wires on the bus, which we got a DNA profile, which linked to another suspect. So they were all linked back in through DNA. Also, they had identified the bomb factory, which was a flat in North London. There, the rubbish was searched, and bottles mounted 440 litres of hydrogen peroxide, which were all empty, had been discovered. So that gave an amount of peroxide that was being used. Those were subjected to fingerprints, and all 5 suspects' fingerprints were on those bottles. So everything was all nicely rolling along as far as we were concerned.
It was a very different challenge for you, a much easier challenge in a way, wasn't it? That because the bombs hadn't gone off, they were recovered virtually intact, and it must have given police quite a lot of insight into the modus operandi of those would-be bombers.
You say they were recovered intact. When each of them was discovered, there was this bubbly sort of yellow mass, and nobody was quite sure what the composition of these bombs were. And they were fearing whether it be a biological attack, a nuclear attack, or a chemical attack. Which one of these? Could they be more dangerous than what they are at the moment? So most of the actual mixture was destroyed. So we were left with just a few grams here and there to work with from these 20-odd litres of material.
I was assuming, I don't know why I assumed it, that essentially the bombs were recovered intact. It's fascinating to hear from you that that really wasn't the case.
No, that wasn't.
And CCTV footage played a crucial role in tracking the suspects as well, didn't it?
Well, CCTV footage was released on the Friday, and it showed reasonable images from each of the 4 suspects. And they were named fairly quickly by members of the public. So they knew the names and everything. It was then a manhunt. Quite a crucial manhunt because you've got 4 would-be suicide bombers on the loose. Were they going to make another attempt? And that just shows the heightened pressure with the Jean-Charles Menezes surveillance.
Martin, there was also meant to be a 5th bomber, wasn't there? Manfo Kwaku Asiedu. But he lost his nerve on the day and dumped his device and ran off. And he turned himself in, I think from memory, about a week later.
Asiedu surrendered and eventually gave evidence against the others. The other 4 men were all found guilty of conspiracy to murder at their trial in 2007. And they got life sentences, as you would expect, with minimum terms of around 40 years each. So they'll likely never be released.
Beyond the bombers themselves, the investigation cast a very wide net. By the end of 2005, there'd been around 40 arrests connected to the 21/7 plot. And that included people that Ray mentioned earlier who assisted the bombers.
Yes, the police went after anyone who had helped this cell. Several relatives and friends of the bombers were prosecuted, including one bomber's wife and associates who'd hid him, and others who knew about the plans but said nothing. They received prison sentences for assisting and for failing to report what they knew. The whole support network around the bombers was exposed, and very soon after the London bombings, there were new laws rushed in. And that was for this very purpose, to help prosecute supporters and encouragers of terrorists.
And Ray, because their bombs failed to explode, the 21/7 plotters later, I think, tried to claim at the trial that it was all a hoax and that they'd never intended to kill anyone and that they just wanted to scare people.
Yes. So I came out with this task of identifying the composition. Over the Christmas period, I managed to get a meeting together with various scientists that I thought they'd be able to contribute to identifying the bomb. FEL totally admitted they were unable to do it, so the task was handed over to us. I've put together this meeting we held at Kew Gardens, and we worked out a plan. And central to that plan was Dr. Stuart Black, who was at the University of Reading, who I'd worked with a couple of times before, but he was invited and we worked out a plan. We did the work at the University of Reading. First of all, we had to decide what type of flower it was. And there's a technique known as X-ray diffraction. And that identified it simply as a wheat flour. So it eliminated pulses, plantain, rice, all of that. We had a wheat flour. And next, we had to decide what brand this wheat flour was. So we set the task of the SO13 of retrieving samples of flour from any brand anywhere in the M25. So get together a big database of flours. And that's what they did. We then used this wonderful technique known as stable isotope analysis. Now, an isotope is basically a different form of a chemical. So carbon has different isotopes. And stable isotopes just measures the ratio of the stable ones. That's the non-radioactive ones. And that can give you various bits of information. It can give you where in the world that wheat was grown. It can compare various wheat flours, one against the other. And we enlisted the carbon isotopes, lead isotopes, and these wheat flours, and identified it Sudoku chapati flour, which is a coincidence because they had that in the bomb factory. So we knew what the flour was now. We now just had to decide how much flour and how much hydrogen peroxide was in each of the devices. So we looked at elemental analysis, the amount of various elements. We chose calcium because that was in flour, but not in hydrogen peroxide. And we chose tin and sodium because they're in peroxides as part of the stabilizers in the peroxide to determine how much peroxide was there. Once we did the analysis on all the bits of the devices put together, we concluded that the devices consisted of 20% flour, and then it was topped up with hydrogen peroxide, approximately 22 litres. But that 22 litres had been concentrated from 400 litres. So the concentration of hydrogen peroxide was calculated at between 58 and 72%. So we now knew we had a device that contains 20% chapati flour, concentrated peroxide between 58 and 72% built up. That was the main charge. FEL were commissioned to make a device to those specifications. And we took that to Paunton Down together with Prosecution Counsel and all the Defence Counsel to see whether or not it would explode. And it went off. It made a huge bang. And this was in the open. I've got a film of it. It is frightening. Now, you can only imagine what devastation that would have done if it's in a tube train with nowhere to go except for outwards.
So they did intend to kill then, Martin?
Yes, Ray, what you essentially did was to prove that the 21/7 bombs that didn't go off were real bombs. Because at the trial, the defence of those 21/7 would-be bombers was that this was no more than a protest against the Iraq War and that the devices weren't designed to be lethal. The forensic evidence demolished that claim. The only reason the bombs didn't cause carnage was a mistake in the chemical mixture. Everything else was real. They had real detonators and real peroxide-based explosive paste. Their intent was clearly to murder, and the jury agreed with the prosecution.
Yeah. The reason the bombs didn't go off is because they didn't get the hydrogen peroxide concentration up high enough. They failed in the basic science, and as they were trying to evaporate it, it was decomposing. Also, against the thing that they didn't mean to hurt anybody, they taped shrapnel, nuts, bolts and washers around the outside of each of these bombs.
Looking at the legacy, Martin, of July 2005, the city's approach to counter-terrorism changed significantly, didn't it?
It did. The legacy was improved counter-terror coordination. The Metropolitan Police created what's known as SO15, the Counter-Terror Command, combining intel and investigation. And it was a model that was replicated around the country eventually. So regional hubs of that counter-terror command were built all over England, Wales and Scotland. MI5 and the police began running more joint operations to preempt attacks. For a long time, they were almost rival organisations with great pride in the way they did things. I think the aftermath of 7/7 taught them that they really did have to work closer together. The Met Commissioner at the time, Sir Ian Blair, claimed there was a 75% increase in counter-terror activity in London immediately after the attacks. So they ramped up surveillance and undercover operations in communities where extremist networks might develop. And in late 2005, 2006, several other terror plots were uncovered and foiled, in part because of the intelligence that emerged from the 21/7 investigations. So there were lots of plots that didn't come to anything, but there were more attacks. There was a very obvious one a year later. 2 bombers blew up a car at Glasgow Airport, and they did that the day after they'd tried to do the same in central London, but that hadn't gone off.
And was there a legacy for forensics, Ray?
Yes, we took the model that we used in 2005 to some of the incidents that Martin's just explained there. The year later, there was the plot to blow up transatlantic aircraft using explosives in drink bottles. We spent probably a couple of months not knowing what the case was and just going through rubbish that had been recovered from outside various properties. And from the morning of the arrest, it all came to thing. And the one in the cars outside the Tiger nightclub in Haymarket and the Glasgow thing, all of those, the legacy of the forensic science and the way it worked was carried over. So I think we were winning in the end.
It is worth mentioning that even before 7/7 in 2004, because essentially everybody expected something like this, an attack of this kind, this nature, that MI5 had been given a 50% boost to its funding and had already embarked on a massive recruitment drive. So there were, by 2005, already a lot more people working in counter-terror. Stepping back, Ray, these 2 cases that we've talked about, Operation Sturdy and Operation Vivace, were very different challenges in a fast-changing world, and both, in their way, forced the Met to adapt its approach, including in forensics. Going from the 90s, where ballistic work was very important, matching bullets and cartridge casings, gunshot residue and stuff, you were having to look at very different methods, weren't you?
Yes, we were having to look at different methods, use of different organisations as well. The Forensic Science Service were very good at DNA, was particularly bad at other simple analytical techniques. And we got to know that these outside organisations, such as University of Reading, had wealth of scientific equipment that we could only dream of. And that was there waiting to be used. But so they could do the science. What I brought to them was I looked after the forensic-y parts of it, the things that we're brought up with, such as continuity and anti-contamination techniques and all of that. So we were working with them and we were getting more and more results, and more of this work was being outsourced. And you've spoken to him, Martin, Dr. Stuart Black.
I have indeed.
The counter-terrorism team were grateful for the work he did. Not always his timeliness, but the work he did was excellent.
I suppose one of the things they had in common from what you've told us today is those really tiny forensic clues.
Yes, the tiny forensic clues and understanding the significance. There's Lockhart's principle, and Paul Kirk said it's only human failure to find those forensic clues, analyse them properly and properly interpret that helps to identify the evidence. So it's meticulous. It's very painstaking work. But as long as you carry that out you will find that evidence eventually.
Ray, I have a feeling you're a legend in your world, and it's been really brilliant talking to you.
It's always enlightening to talk to Ray, and I've learned that over many, many years. But even now, all these years on, I've learned so many new things about cases that I've been involved in.
Hey listeners, your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.